Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this video, we are going to continue our exploration of motivation that started in the previous lecture. This now is video number 2 of 3 dealing with the topic of motivation. And in this second lecture, what we'll be looking at are some more contemporary theories of motivation that developed after the classic scientific management way of looking at what motivates employees, as well as the revelation that was given to us by the Hawthorne studies and the Hawthorne effect as mentioned in the textbook. And so the first of the more contemporary or historical theories that we've seen was suggested to us by the psychologist Abraham Maslow, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. His theory essentially suggests that there are 5 levels of human needs, and he would argue that basic needs must first be fulfilled before people work to satisfy the higher level needs. And so it's a sequential thing for Maslow. Maslow says, unless the fundamental baseline needs are met, no one even bothers to think about the higher level needs until they feel satisfied at the lower levels. This is oftentimes illustrated as a pyramid for us, as you see here in the next slide. What this diagram attempts to portray in the pyramid, those 5 levels of needs, starting at the very baseline, the bottom of the pyramid, physiological needs. And that would include things like food and shelter. And then above that are security needs, things having to do with stability in your environment and your emotional needs. And then from there, above that are social needs, needs for relationships and friendships, interrelationships with people around you that you care about. And then the 4th level of needs, esteem needs, having to do with status. And then finally, at the very top, self-actualization needs, where people begin to ask themselves questions and seek fulfillment in terms of their self-fulfillment, meaning and purpose, and those kinds of things. Now, when we distill these into translations in the workplace, you see that on the right-hand side, organizational examples, what that might look like. A physiological need would be on the job, you need to have an adequate salary to pay your bills and to pay your rent. And so the suggestion here, of course, at each of the higher levels is, unless you are receiving adequate salary, you don't care about any of the other needs until that baseline is met. So the next level up, presuming you do get your salary needs met, the next thing is you're worried about security needs, and that would be illustrated by perhaps a retirement plan, or quite frankly, just simply the idea of job security, that you'd be able to have a job when you come in the next week. From there are social needs at work that you begin to think about. If your physiological and security needs are met, you see the illustration there that you have friends and relationships at work. If those things are together, then you would emotionally move to the 4th level of needs, esteem needs, looking perhaps ambitiously looking for a prestigious job title, or those kinds of things. And then finally, at the very top, self-actualization needs, looking for meaning and fulfillment in your job, in the work itself. So that would be sort of the suggestion of Maslow with this, one of the very first fundamental psychological explorations of what motivates people. Now, we would tell you right there at the outset that there are some pros and cons to Maslow and his theory of the hierarchy of human needs. We would have to say that, first of all, we owe a great debt to Maslow and his research and work, because this was one of the first organized psychological theories of what motivates people. And it does recognize that there are nuances and levels, and there are different things that motivate people, and to consider all of those kinds of things when we talk about motivation, whether someone is sufficiently motivated or not, those kinds of things. And so we owe a great debt to Maslow, and this theory has been useful as we sort of begin our exploration of what drives women and men in terms of motivation. However, there are some weaknesses in Maslow's theory. Remember that Maslow was very, very pointed in suggesting that these hierarchy of needs, these level of needs, are indeed sequential. In other words, that until the baseline is met, you never get to the next level in terms of concern and thinking about and focus and need and those kinds of things. And then unless those first two are met, you never get to the third, etc., etc., etc. And we would suggest that our own human experience really doesn't work that way. Is it really true that if you're working in a job where you really are not getting paid enough, you're meeting most of your financial needs, but yeah, you need a side hustle to really make ends meet, does it really mean that you don't care at all about job security or about having friends at that job or what kind of status and esteem that brings to you, or that you never really find any meaning in that job unless the salary needs are first met? Clearly, that's not really the case in most instances. Now, certainly there are extreme examples, right? If you are working your patootie off and you're not getting paid minimum wage, then yeah, maybe you're never going to ever worry about self-actualization until you get yourself a better paycheck. But generally speaking, human beings are concerned with many of these classes of needs concurrently and simultaneously. And so it's very, very difficult to really run with Maslow to the conclusion that these things really are sequential and linear. But nevertheless, it is a beginning of an interesting discussion that there are multiple layers and levels of needs when we talk about what motivates people. Now, we have one other theory that we want to consider in this particular video lecture, which is pretty compelling and gives us some things to think about. And that would be Herzberg's two-factor theory. So Herzberg's two-factor theory, Herzberg was a researcher that did some research exclusively with managers at work. And so right there, when we talk about motivation at work, Herzberg has narrowed his focus not to people in general, but simply to managers. And so one of the things that Herzberg posits is that there are two different classes of factors out there. There is a theory of motivation holding that job satisfaction depends on two classes or categories of factors, what Herzberg calls hygiene factors and motivation factors. Now, that may not be immediately clear what he means by those two categories. We'll talk about that in a second. The insight that comes from this is that job satisfaction and job dissatisfaction are not points on the same spectrum. They are two distinctly different things. You can have no job satisfaction, zero job satisfaction, and that is different than being dissatisfied with your job. Let's see if we can illustrate that in the next slide. It should become clearer with this second slide. The idea here is that on the right, there are what Herzberg called hygiene factors that you have to have or you will be dissatisfied with your job. So you can see them there, that you have supervisors who you enjoy working for, or at least you don't hate, that the working conditions are generally safe and clean, that your interpersonal relationships are generally okay, that you have an adequate level of pay and security, that you generally can live with company policies and administration. And you see there the bottom arrow in the blue there, that what that will lead to, if you have them in sufficient amount, you will simply not be dissatisfied with the job. And of course, if things are really bad, you are actively dissatisfied with your job. But notice here the suggestion. If you have all those hygiene factors in adequate amounts, it simply means you are not dissatisfied with the job. This is something significantly different than the motivation factors under work content in the yellow there. You see there under work content, motivation factors are things like a sense of achievement, being recognized for the work, meaning in the work itself, your level of responsibility, your opportunities for advancement and growth. And you see there, if you have all those things in great measure, then those are the kinds of things that lead to job satisfaction. But interestingly, what that means is if you don't have those motivation factors in sufficient amount, it merely leads to no satisfaction, which in Herzberg's terminology is different than dissatisfaction. I hope that makes sense. It's an interesting distinction here because there's a couple of conclusions we can reach here, right? Now, here's the first conclusion. This may describe, quite frankly, many of our jobs when we're just getting started in the work world. For instance, I'm willing to accept the premise that perhaps some of you have jobs right now that you don't love. It's just sort of paying the bills. You may be working in retail. You may be pulling a shift at a sandwich shop or a coffee shop. And if I were to ask you, hey, how's work going? You would say something like this, perhaps. Well, I appreciate the fact that my boss, he understands I'm in school, so he gives me some schedule flexibility, and he lets me have time off during finals or times I've got to study. And I like the people there generally. We all get along. We have a good time occasionally, but the money is okay, but it's not like I'm going to stay there the rest of my career. That's why I'm getting a business degree. Does that make sense? All right. What Herzberg would say is you don't have job dissatisfaction, but that doesn't lead naturally to satisfaction on the job. In fact, for many of us, what leads to satisfaction on the job are things like, man, I think I am really using all of my skills. When I'm at work, I just feel alive. I feel like I'm making a difference in the world, feel like I'm contributing to society. I'm doing a great job. I'm making a huge impact in people's lives. That's really the thing that really just sort of gets my juices going. That's really where it's at. I love my job. Does this make sense? So that's the first conclusion, that these concepts of being dissatisfied with the job is one set that you see there sort of illustrated in the purple, versus in the yellow, those are the kinds of things that really lead to job satisfaction. When people say, I love my job, I'm satisfied with my job, I have meaning and purpose in my work. Now here's the other conclusion, interestingly, that comes from Herzberg. When you look at the slide, where is pay? Where's money? You're right. Money is in the hygiene factors, the purple side, the right side of this. And so one of the insightful conclusions from Herzberg's theory is this. Do you mean to tell me that no matter how much money you pay me, that will not, over the long term, lead to job satisfaction? Let me repeat that. Does that mean that if I were to pay you like NBA, like NFL level money, like a professional athlete, that would not necessarily lead to job satisfaction? And some of you, I realize, are saying right now, you are talking to the screen. You're saying, what? You are crazy. You are high. Because if you paid me NFL level money for what I do right now, I would be satisfied. And I would suggest over time, you would be wrong. Why is that? Because I would suggest, well, money can buy some wonderful things, especially here in the United States, right? That money is really not what brings life satisfaction, and certainly not satisfaction to work. For some of you, you may have to take my word on it. You may have to take it on faith. But I will tell you this, in my career, I have had some great jobs, and I've been well paid in many of them. And money buys nice cars, a great house, some fun vacations, lets you put your kids in private school, and a lot of other great stuff. But that's not really what brings satisfaction in life. Satisfaction in life is about making a durable impact in other people's lives and leaving a legacy of people's lives being better because of the things that you put your effort into. At least for my money, anecdotally for my life, I feel like I have proven the point. It's proven to me that Herzberg was right after all. Let's be honest, this is the United States. Poverty does not buy happiness either. But I would agree with Herzberg that money is really a source of the hygiene factors, of making sure you're not dissatisfied with what you pursue as a vocation. But real satisfaction of the job comes from deeper things. Well, these are some pretty important things to consider, especially as we think about our own careers and we think about the careers and the vocation and life of those who we will lead and manage. So I trust you will at least, sort of roll these things around in your head. Perhaps we'll have a writing assignment for you to respond to that. We'll see you in the next lecture.